After the Sabbath, at dawn on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to look at the tomb. There was a violent earthquake, for an angel of the Lord came down from heaven, and going to the tomb, rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothes were white as snow. The guards were so afraid of him that they shook and became like dead men. The angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here. He has risen, just as he said. Come and see the place where he lay. Then go quickly and tell his disciples, he has risen from the dead and is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him. Now I have told you." So the women hurried away from the tomb, afraid yet filled with joy, and ran to tell his disciples. Suddenly Jesus met them. "Greetings," he said. They came to him, clasped his feet, and worshipped him. Then Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee. There they will see me." While the women were on their way, some of the guards went into the city and reported to the chief priests everything that had happened. When the chief priests had met with the elders and devised a plan, they gave the soldiers a large sum of money, telling them, "You are to say, 'His disciples came during the night and stole him away while we were asleep.' If this report gets to the governor, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble." So the soldiers took the money and did as they were instructed. And this story has been widely circulated among the Jews to this day. Then the disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go. When they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. When Jesus came to them and said, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always, to the very end of the age."
Well, happy Easter, everybody. 2 days ago, on Good Friday, we marked the death of Jesus on the cross for us. And today, we celebrate the resurrection of Jesus. And as on Good Friday, we worked through Matthew chapter 27. Today, we're looking at the final chapter of Matthew, chapter 28. And can I encourage you, if you have a Bible handy, why not open up and follow along as we do? This chapter has roughly three sort of scenes. In the first scene, we hear about the women, the followers of Jesus, who go and visit his tomb. And there's some dramatic events that take place. There's an earthquake, an angel appears, terrifies the guards, and rolls the stone away. And the angel tells the women that Jesus has risen from the dead, and that they should hurry and tell his disciples. So they head off with mixed feelings. And then they encounter Jesus himself, risen, and Jesus greets them and they worship him. In the second scene, the guards, terrified by the angel's appearance, have recovered and they report back to the city. They're not sure what to do now, so they meet with the chief priests and they come up with a plan together to cover up what happened. They're going to start a rumor, it says, that the disciples of Jesus stole his body. The final scene in this chapter is a few days later up north in Galilee. Jesus' disciples have gathered and Jesus appears to them as well. And he instructs them to go and to make disciples of all nations and encourages them that he will be with them always. There's a lot in this chapter, and particularly being Easter Sunday, our focus really is on the resurrection of Jesus and how this all ties into the resurrection. Jesus being raised from the dead to new life. Well, the resurrection is a challenge for many. And it's not necessarily because there's a lack of evidence or historical record. In fact, there's significant evidence and historical record for the resurrection of Jesus. In comparison to other events from the same time, in fact, there's lots of evidence compared to, say, the records of Caesar's victories at the same time. His victories appear shaky in the historical record compared to the resurrection. But nobody questions any of Julius Caesar's victories, of course, because they're believable, aren't they? People win and lose battles all the time. These things happen. The resurrection is a challenge because it is very hard to believe. For some, unbelievable. This doesn't happen. Humans don't rise from the dead. So we're tempted to try and explain it away. Well, maybe Jesus didn't really die. Maybe he just fainted on the cross. That's possible. He was almost dead. The Romans they took him down a little bit early. He was barely alive, but still breathing. He recovered with a bit of rest in the tomb and got out. This position is rarely promoted today. It's really an insult to what we know, everything we know about the Roman death machine. They were excellent at execution. The process was consistent and reliable. Jesus died on the cross that day. A more popular theory is that maybe Jesus didn't rise physically, but his followers had a sense of new life in Jesus, a metaphorical resurrection, if you will. He didn't rise bodily, but he sort of rose in the hearts of his followers. I think this is a lovely theory, but the gospel writers don't really leave us that option. The accounts are very clearly of the physical bodily rising of Jesus. Matthew's account, for example, makes that very clear. In the message from the angel and the reaction of the women when they hear that Jesus is risen, they don't consider it to be a metaphorical rising where they might think, oh, what a lovely thought, what a heartwarming sentiment. No, they react as if it's the news of a genuine physical resurrection. They are confused. They're a bit excited because this is their friend, but they're also a bit afraid because this is something that does not happen. We also see this in the reaction of the chief priests and the soldiers. They are genuinely worried about what has happened. They're not expecting just some nice stories to waft out. They're worried, and so they start making a plan. The other question you might have is, okay, but why does this matter? Surely it's just as good if it's a metaphorical resurrection. I mean, isn't the main point of the resurrection that Jesus is with us now? Couldn't that really be true even if he's not bodily resurrected? Why should we insist on the physicality? Well, it is true that Jesus is with us now, and this is confirmed from the resurrection. The very last line of today's passage confirms this. Jesus says, "Surely I am with you always to the very end of the age." But I don't think this is the main point of the resurrection. The main point of the resurrection is it means Jesus has defeated death. Jesus has defeated death. And for this to be true, it can't be a metaphor. Jesus can't be still buried in the ground, rotting away. No, if Jesus has defeated death, it has to be physical. Let's consider this for a moment. As you know, history is full of great leaders, and we often measure great leaders by their great victories, when they conquer great enemies. So Alexander the Great, he conquered most of his known world by the age of 30. Genghis Khan conquered most of Asia and Eastern Europe. Napoleon Bonaparte from France pushed all the way to Russia. It's true as well, isn't it, that our world faces a great enemy now, COVID-19, the virus. And whoever discovers the vaccine first will be considered a great hero. It'll probably be a team of scientists in some country, and they will be rightly celebrated. There are many enemies to be defeated, many great enemies, but none is so great as death. Death is the enemy that all fear. One of my favourite poems is Shelley's Ozymandias, which describes beautifully the power of death over even a great ruler. It says, I met a traveller from an antique land who said, 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal, these words appear, my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. It's a description of a statue of a mighty king who has succumbed to death and whose great statue now crumbles in the desert. Death is the ultimate enemy. It's the enemy that no great ruler has conquered. And yet in rising from the dead, Jesus has conquered death. Death's spotless record has been broken. Death is no longer undefeatable. You might think, of course, well, that's wonderful news for Jesus, but how does this help us? The Bible uses a range of descriptions to explain what it means when people have faith in Jesus, when people trust in what Jesus has done for us, dying on the cross in our place, as we looked at on Friday. Perhaps the most common expression used in the Bible is that people with faith in Jesus are in Christ. It's a pretty odd phrase to use, but it captures the sense in which we are united with Christ, joined with Jesus, and to a large degree, what happened to Jesus will happen to us. In Romans 6, the Apostle Paul describes this particularly with reference to Jesus' death and resurrection. He writes that our unity with Jesus means we will have new life just as Jesus did. Romans 6, for if we have been united with him in a death like his, we will certainly also be united with him in a resurrection like his. For we know that our old self was crucified with him so that the body ruled by sin might be done away with, that we should no longer be slaves to sin, because anyone who has died has been set free from sin. Now, if we died with Christ, we believe that we also live with him. In rising from the dead to new bodily life, Jesus has defeated death for himself, certainly, and for us as well. This doesn't mean that followers of Jesus will never die, but it means that just as Jesus died and then had new life, life after death, so will those who have faith in Jesus have life after death. In John 11:25, Jesus explains this when he says, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Well, I wonder, do you fear death? Now is a particularly scary time. It's a time when death might feel quite close. Descriptions of death by COVID-19 are particularly painful. It's a respiratory condition. The reality is, so far, there is no vaccine for this virus. Death is objectively scary, I think. But while death might be scary now, particularly, the reality is we will all die. At some time, life will end and death will get us. But what if there was someone who had defeated death? Not Alexander the Great, not Genghis Khan, not even the scientists who will one day find a vaccine. No, someone who has faced death themselves and then come back to tell the tale and say, come with me. I mean, this is a king worth following. The king who destroys the greatest enemy is the king to follow. Yes, we will still die, but if we have faith in Jesus, there need not any longer be any fear in death, because we know we'll have life beyond death, life with Jesus. So death is stripped of its power. In 1 Corinthians, the Apostle Paul writes, and it's a beautiful line, we sang it in a song just a moment ago, where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting? It sounds kind of wonderful for life today, doesn't it? It sounds almost easy, as if death were no longer an enemy or a threat. It's interesting, in today's passage, even in the first days of the resurrection, we see two examples of followers of Jesus for whom life is not all celebration and fearlessness. No, these are very real examples of real people who had faith. Firstly, we meet the women followers of Jesus, who are examples of faithfulness like no other. They were the last ones standing at the cross as Jesus died, and they've now faithfully come to anoint his body at the tomb. And yet hear their reaction when they hear the good news of the resurrection. In verse 8, Matthew 28, verse 8, the women hurried away from the tomb, afraid and yet filled with joy, and ran to tell his disciples. They were afraid and yet filled with joy. They had both fear and joy. Now, look, you might think in their defense, to be fair, they only had the news. They actually hadn't seen Jesus at this point. Fair point. The other example is the disciples. And these disciples actually have seen Jesus. In fact, for some of them, they're seeing him as this passage describes them. Here's what it says. Verse 17, when they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. They worshipped and some doubted. Worship and doubt. There's two interesting combinations. We've got joy and fear, and we have worship and doubt. I wonder if you can relate to these early followers of Jesus. Do you have fear? Maybe it's fear of death, even though you know in your head that Jesus has defeated death. Even though, like these women, there are moments of joy, does fear have its place in your life too? Maybe our current circumstances have exacerbated this for you. Or maybe you have doubt, like the disciples. Maybe you doubt Jesus' resurrection. Maybe you doubt who Jesus is or something else. Maybe like the disciples as well, you still worship, but doubt is there. Let me suggest a few things. Firstly, don't despair about this. I think one mistake that has sometimes been made in the past is to turn feelings of fear and doubt into the worst of all calamities, to the point where people with doubts feel like they can't even ask their questions or be honest about their uncertainty. I really like that the Bible is honest and real enough to describe these feelings, even in these wonderful early examples of faith. I almost wonder, how did Matthew know the women had fear or the disciples had doubt? Presumably, some of them told him. Presumably, some were honest enough to say, yeah, I was afraid. Yeah, I had my doubts. So if you have fear or if you doubt, please do not panic and do not feel like a failure. Be honest. Tell God about it. Tell a friend about it. Acknowledge that mixture of feelings you have. Secondly, I'd say pursue faith and confidence. I wonder if as a result of negative treatment about fear and doubt, it's been fashionable in recent times to cast things like doubt as a great virtue. We sometimes read things like doubt rather than faith is actually the key to following Jesus, or that doubting faith is mature faith, something like that. This seems to be an overcorrection, I think. We don't need to be ashamed of our fears and doubts, but we don't want to tip the pendulum too far the other way either. Doubt is not condemned like hypocrisy or judgmentalism is, but it's not celebrated either. Jesus treats genuine doubters and the fearful with love and compassion. Not that they would forever remain doubting and fearful, but that they might overcome their doubts and their fears. One wonderful example is in Mark chapter 9, where Jesus meets a man whose son has an unclean spirit. And Jesus questions the man, and the man admits his mixture of faith and doubt. With this beautiful line in verse 24, Mark 9:24, he cries out, "I do believe, help me overcome my unbelief." It's a mixture of belief and unbelief. And Jesus doesn't condemn him for his outburst, but he doesn't congratulate him for it either. Instead, what Jesus does is he does the one thing that will help this man move from doubt to strong faith. He heals his boy. It's beautiful. Jesus doesn't want us to remain in doubt or fear. He wants us to grow towards confidence and faith. In Hebrews 11, we have this beautiful, positive, confident definition of faith. Now, faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. The third thing I want to say is have joy even in fear and worship even in doubt. The other great thing about these descriptions here of the women and the disciples is they were able to respond to God even while they feared and doubted. The women weren't just so seized with fear at the news, so overcome they could not do anything else. No, they had joy even in their fear. The disciples, they weren't just so paralyzed by doubt, they just gave up or turned away from God. No, they worshipped even while they doubted. Do you have fear even now? Do you have doubt? Please don't feel like you need to put following Jesus on hold. No, as you see today, you can have joy even while you fear, and you can worship God even while you doubt. Well, at the end of today's reading, Jesus gives his final instructions to his disciples. These have been known as the Great Commission. He says, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age." These might be familiar words to you. They're usually used in the context of mission or sharing our faith or even baptism, which are excellent contexts. But today we see these words come straight from the resurrection, don't they? For many disciples, these are the first words they hear from the risen Jesus. And Jesus makes this link himself too when he says, "All authority has been given to me." See, the disciples know this now, don't they? This is the man who's just defeated death, the greatest of all enemies. What a clear confirmation of Jesus' authority. And so this resurrected Jesus, this one who has defeated death, the one who has all authority, he's got some instructions for his followers, and it's a call to mission. These instructions also are not just for Jesus' first followers. No, these are for all who follow Jesus at all times, including us. And it's also important to notice these aren't instructions just for Jesus' greatest followers. You might think, well, okay, sure, some Christians need to hear this call to mission, but I mean, not me. I've got to sort out my doubt or my fear first. No, Jesus even calls his doubting followers as well as confident ones. I think if we wait till we're holy enough or if we think we're mature enough, we'll never act on Jesus' words. One of the wonderful things is that the basis of sharing the good news about Jesus is not our wonderful, perfect faith. The basis is Jesus' defeat over death. He doesn't say all confidence and faith and joy and power and wisdom has been given to you, therefore go and make disciples. He says, all authority has been given to me, therefore go. He calls uncertain disciples then as now to spread his word. So what is this call? Well, firstly, Jesus says go. When Jesus gave this first direction, there were very few followers of Jesus. They were basically all Jewish. They lived in a very small part of the world. Jesus said go. It was time for them to go, to spread out to the wider world. For us, this is a wonderful, ever-present reminder that the world, the whole world, needs to know Jesus. Now, unfortunately, it is hard for us to literally go at the moment. We're in lockdown, but we can still reach out. We can still consider those who are in our networks, those we could contact by a phone call, an email, a letter, online. We can't go physically, but we can reach out with the words of Jesus on our lips. Secondly, he says, make disciples. A disciple is a follower, a learner, and in relation to Jesus, they're a worshipper of Jesus. Making disciples as well is a gradual process. It takes time. And Jesus wants to see disciples making disciples. See, it's an ongoing process he wants to see across generations. Well, why would we try to make disciples of Jesus? The The most obvious reason, I think, is we have incredible news to proclaim. The defeat of death by Jesus is always good news. And I think particularly at this time, as people are nervous and concerned, and understandably so, this is wonderful news. In Jesus, who rose from the dead on that first Easter Sunday, we need not fear death. We have a message of hope and life to proclaim. The message that Jesus has defeated death is a wonderful message to share. Thirdly, Jesus says, go baptizing. Baptism is a sign of personal commitment to Jesus. Jesus is looking for people who are committed to him. What might baptism look like now in our lockout times? Honestly, I'm not actually sure. But I want to say I think we can work this out. If you know a follower of Jesus who's ready to be baptized, please do contact us at the office. We can work out how to do this today, even with our restrictions, I'm sure. And fourthly, Jesus says, pass on my teaching. There is content to Jesus' mission. He wants people to learn and grow from his teaching. And for us, this means we can keep learning and reading and listening to Jesus. We can actually take the opportunity of having less outings, less social gatherings perhaps, to keep growing in our faith personally. And we can keep encouraging others with what we learn. Well, today, Easter Sunday, we mark the resurrection of Jesus. Jesus, who once was dead, is alive again. It's good news. Resurrection is good news, isn't it? It's great news, in fact. Jesus' victory over death means freedom from fear of death for God's people. And I want to say, even if you still fear, and even if you still doubt, we can still have joy. We can still worship God, even in the midst of our uncertainty, just like Jesus' first followers. The resurrection of Jesus also, we see, includes a call to mission. Again, this isn't based on our maturity or wisdom, but it's based on Jesus, who has overcome death and so is shown to be the one with all authority. What a wonderful message we have to proclaim. Amen. Happy Easter, everyone.